Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with Ratio Christie's Jane Pantig. Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Things look a lot different for you right now because you're no longer on campuses,
Mhm.
but tell us about what you typically do.
So I typically go to campus. So obviously, with what's going on, we're no longer allowed to be on campus. So we have conversations with students about any question that they have, and we have conversations and try to answer those and think logically and critically through them, and hopefully giving them satisfying answers.
So when you say that you have these conversations, what does that look like? What is your setup when you're on campus?
Well, it depends on what schools are at, but two of the ones that we have really open conversations are at UCLA and Santa Monica, where we just set out blankets and have snacks and have signs that invite people into conversation. And we just have a group of people going through the questions that they have for the day, and it's just a really great conversation that we have on a blanket in a circle and just eating snacks together.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to just invite people in. I'm guessing that in those conversations, of course, we're seeing a lot of this right now with the pandemic and with racial tensions,
Oh yeah.
that you're probably getting questions about suffering and how we look at suffering in light of free will. So, what sort of questions do your students have involving suffering and free will?
Well, obviously, we have this pandemic, and a lot of people are suffering from that. So, with that, people are thinking, well, if we don't survive these things, and I suffer and I die, what happens when we die? So, it naturally leads into death. So, but in the suffering, like, people want to know, it's like, why are we suffering? What's the cause of our suffering? And what can we do in this pain and suffering? So people are always looking for something more positive, as we're going through this.
Right. And so when we think from a Christian perspective, we look at suffering and we look at free will and we grapple with it. But I think for sure for non-theists, for those who aren't Christian,
Mhm.
that for them, something that they might be wondering is how a good God would allow us to experience suffering. So
Yeah.
how would you respond to that sort of challenge?
Yeah, so I like to take the approach of giving them some options. So we have three basic, options or responses to suffering. So we have pantheism, where it affirms there is a God, but like suffering and evil actually don't exist. So it's all an illusion. And then we have atheism, where it affirms there's evil, but there's no God. And so you don't actually have a grounding or a standard of what good and evil or suffering is. And then in Christianity, we have something that affirms both. So we know there's God and there's evil. So you line those up and explain that to people. People will probably think theism might be the best option out of those, because obviously pain and suffering is real. So with pantheism, it's telling you it doesn't exist. So it's like you could probably get rid of that one pretty quickly. And then with atheism, well, I can't even tell you that suffering actually, like there is actually suffering if there isn't a standard for it. So they're kind of ungrounded. So if you lay those out, I mean, Christianity probably gives us the best hope for why we could get through suffering and evil.
And I think that's a great way, just kind of laying out the different isms and
Mhm.
unpacking them to say, like, where do we get even the idea of suffering? Um, where do we get that? And
Yeah.
especially from an atheistic perspective. So I think that's a really helpful approach. And I would guess that the next step then in their questioning is to then think about free will.
Mhm.
So how do you explain free will?
Yeah. So basically, free will is the option to do A or B. It's like you have options to do something. You have more than one option, is basically what free will is. In contrast to determinism, where you're just determined to do those things, which is more of an atheistic worldview. It's like what Dawkins would say is like you're dancing to your DNA. So there is no free will in atheism.
Oh, that's interesting. So I've never actually heard that there isn't free will in atheism. Um, do those atheists that you've spoken with, do they agree to that notion?
It depends on what atheists you're talking about. I think the ones that probably thought it through a little bit more would deny free will because they've thought about it, and it's just actually an illusion that you have free will, but you don't actually have free will.
And that's their perspective, that it's just an
Mhm.
illusion.
Yeah. But the
So
ones who are atheists and haven't really thought about it, they would like to think they do have free will. So it really just depends on who you're talking to.
yeah. Well,
Mhm.
I think that's a good reminder then when we are engaging in conversation, whether it's on campus or just somehow, whatever that looks like these days,
Mhm.
um, that we kind of, it seems important in what you're doing is that we define those terms first.
Mhm.
So, what would you say then is kind of a key takeaway to really help people's approach as they're engaging some of these tough topics? Yeah, what would you say is a key takeaway to help our viewers address some of these concerns?
I think asking the person good questions because we can't assume because like if we logically follow what atheism has to say about free will, we could assume that there isn't any. But then the person you're talking to might say there is. So you actually have to deal with the person that you're talking to and then show them. Well, actually, your worldview entails this if you're actually following it. So, like talking through what a worldview establishes because some people have worldviews but aren't consistent with it, and to actually grapple and have kind of have them be more consistent because sometimes people pick and choose what they think their worldview entails. So like having those conversations and showing where contradictions can happen, but I think the most important thing is asking them good questions and working those things out with them because it's never you can never just assume that they're the textbook atheist or the textbook um, Buddhist because that's just not my experience. Like people will say, well, I adhere to this worldview, but then you're actually not fully adhering to it.
So really what you're saying then is that in your interactions, you're sometimes getting a menagerie of worldviews, even within the same person. So I think that your approach is definitely one that will help, knowing that we need to be able to ask good questions and ask for where people are in their particular iteration of their worldview. But I think that what you've demonstrated is that it's so important to know not only our own worldview, but the worldviews that we are likely going to encounter so that we know and we're ready to respond, and to respond, of course, as I'm sure you do, graciously and with compassion and with desire to really show that you want to learn more about the person you're engaging with. So I love the work that you're doing. um, and I want to just give you one more chance to kind of share what it is you do and how our viewers can find you.
Yeah, so I work with Ratio Christi and I do apologetics and evangelism. You can find me on our website, www.ratiochristi.org, and just type in my name. And I'm also starting a YouTube channel where I'm just kind of going through questions that students have asked throughout the years and having crucial conversations of what's going on in our cultural moments right now. And my YouTube channel is Exchanged, but it's a play on words with my name. So it's actually spelled EXJANEGE. So you just could go find me on YouTube. And yeah, I'll be there.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. And I just so value the work that you're doing with Ratio Christi. I pray that you'll just find some creative ways to continue engaging with students and with Gen Z. It's very important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.